Hello, everyone. I wanted to make some comments related to race relations in the United States here, especially in the context of the controversy with Charlottesville. I have to be totally honest here. I'm not plugged into the 24-hour news cycle. I haven't been paying really close attention to this. I haven't seen a live feed from television other than snippets when I'm at the gym where the volume's off, and I'm not really paying attention. Uh, since I've been off work, I spend most of my time hiking in the White Mountains, going to the gym, and reading. And I'd much rather divide my time that way than spend it, constantly consuming an endless stream of, you know, material, most of which I have no effect over and can't really control. But I do think that, I premise that also to say, I don't know all the details about what happened there, who did what, in what sequence, who's morally wrong or less morally wrong, or who's to blame, or all that. I've seen a classic case based on Facebook posts of each side just categorically, assuming that the other side is completely wrong about everything, which is totally unhelpful, but also sadly typical of pretty much any kind of dispute that happens nowadays, if not throughout perpetuity. But I do think it's an interesting kind of benchmark for where we've gotten to at this point. So I think to start off by saying that like racism is certainly not new. Racism is ubiquitous in human history in every society for which we have knowledge. And the same can be said for slavery. Now, slavery and racism are not always paired together. They are in the American mind because of the specific history in the United States, but historically, typically, you wouldn't have a strong association between um, race distinction and slavery. In fact, slavery would often be including people who were racially similar or identical. Uh, so that is itself a more recent phenomenon within the United States. I'm sure it's happened other places where there's distinctions between races and between the enslaved and this enslaving. But historically, that's not always the case, certainly, even if it is sometimes. Um, Now, the idea that and I mention that because within the context of the United States, these two ideas and the institution of slavery and the idea of racism are intertwined. But I have to say that hypothetically, they don't need to be. There's no reason that these have to be um, joined at the hip. But if we want to understand where we are, it's important to put the association there. So slavery existed in the United States very early in the colonial times. Obviously, Native Americans practiced various forms of slavery. Um, and that's something else to point out is that slavery has been very different over the course of history. Yes, it's very true that it's widespread and probably universal among human cultures, but not practiced in the same way. So the chattel slavery, for which we're all familiar, the plantation slavery of the American South, is not the type of slavery that would have existed in Native American societies or in African societies or in Chinese society or in Roman society. And that's not to say it's distinct and all the other ones are normative. They all have their own distinctions and own differences. Hunter-gatherers have slaves, but they don't operate and use them in the same way. And that's not to, you know, say that chattel slavery in the United States was particularly evil or particularly unique, just to say that it was different. And unfortunately, that kind of colors, again, Americans' perception of the institution because they hear slavery and they think of a very specific thing. Almost like when someone says Indian and they think of teepees and sometimes fail to realize like that is, only correct in certain restricted senses and not generalized for everyone. But it's in the course of if we're talking about race relations in the United States, so it makes sense to just admit that there's the association there because that's how most people view it. So anyway, slavery was introduced very early. It had an increasingly racial character, although not initially. Many of the initial slaves were Native Americans, and then you have this process of indentured servitude and possibly even actual slavery of whites that is not was not did not certainly become as commonplace as black slavery, but it's more common than people think because it's essentially completely omitted from the narrative. And I don't think there's too much to be made out of that other than um, it's worth pointing out that what people have in their minds is something that they have a very specific point in history that they're thinking about, and then generalizing that over everything, and that's has limited use. But anyway, fun fact: even at the time of the Civil War, New Mexico had about 3,000 slaves, almost all of which were like Anasa or Hopi Indians, just Indians who had been enslaved into a kind of Spanish plantation system. Uh, but again, when people talk about slavery in the United States, they obviously don't have that in mind. And given the numbers, it's fine to, say, well, we're talking about slavery of blacks in the American South, raising cotton and tobacco and other cash crops. So uh, slavery was common. It became financially viable in the 19th century. But before that happened, we had the American Revolution. And one of the interesting things about the United States is that its genesis as a nation state and as a society that's explicitly differentiated, as a colonial society that explicitly differentiates itself from its host society, from England, from Europe, happened at the time of the Enlightenment. And you had all these leading figures in the American Revolution and in American government for a generation after, if not more, and that were strongly influenced and in many ways epitomized Enlightenment ideals, and that these ideals were pervasive within society. They weren't the only ideals in society. They didn't affect everyone the same or as much, but they were very, very persuasive, and they left an indelible mark on American society that is still very, very present. It's been eroded, it's been mutated, it's kind of gone through all kinds of changes, but there's still a lot of that that's still there. And many Enlightenment ideas uh, have either implicitly anti-slavery and anti-racist themes or explicitly anti-slavery, anti-racist themes. It depends on the thinker and the idea, right? It's not. I don't think it's fair to say, well, the Enlightenment is always totally against slavery and racism, or always for it or always against it. But it has many. You get this strong impetus against it, and the only alternative kind of view is some of the people after um, the Reformation, where you get some of the Anabaptists, some of the Christian sects who also had anti-slavery and anti-racist ideas. So especially here, it stands out in my mind, the Quakers, the Shakers, and some of the other Anabaptists. And if you look in the United States specifically, the first anti-slavery tracts are coming from them, not from Enlightenment thinkers, but from these Anabaptist sects. But that type of anti-slavery, it led eventually to things like the abolitionist movement. A lot of the abolitionists were kind of members and very pious members of these puritanical Quaker sects. But that is not the ideology that dominated the American landscape, at least in terms of the masses of the people. Had a very disproportional effect on the educational elite of the Ivy League, of the New England intellectual aristocracy, which has always had a disproportionate effect on the rest of the population, but wasn't necessarily the view of all the settlers in, say, the upper Midwest or in the mid-Atlantic states or out west or anyplace else. Um, but so there was this general feeling at the time of the American Revolution that slavery, well, yes, it existed, and practically maybe it should be allowed to exist, but it was basically an institution that was historically anachronistic and that would probably eventually die out. And you even had serious efforts in the late 17th or late 18th, early 19th century to abolish slavery in places like Virginia, which was at the time the largest slave owning state probably. Um, this, and you have people like Thomas Jefferson are like, well, it's wrong, but I don't know what to do about it, so I'm just going to let it go for now, right? This implication was quite strong. Now, in the 19th century, slavery became very economically viable, at least in terms of gang-based plantation agriculture. Using teams of slaves to and driving them was the term that they always driving them to produce cotton. And there's a whole debate about the utility or disutility of that I don't want to get into. But there became a strong economic incentive, at least among slave owners anyway, to perpetuate the institution. But by the time of the American Civil War, it was interesting. Yes, slavery was accepted in the South and begrudgingly accepted by most of the North, at least where it existed, if not in other places. But many Southerners even had this sense that slavery probably was wrong or could be wrong. And obviously, they could turn to the Bible and find passages that justified slavery, that even mandated slavery in certain cases. And they had a literature of uh, Southern intellectuals who were trying to rationalize it. But many, many people in the South, even the actual slave owners, and apparently many women, had a feeling, look, England abolished slavery, France had abolished slavery, uh, Western Europe was abolishing slavery, and granted, most of the rest of the world wasn't, but among the culture that they identified with and that they were a part of, slavery seemed like a very old-fashioned, very brutal, and indeed very evil institution. And there was this widespread sense that this was the case. Now, even among people who were against slavery, the idea of racial equality was rather unusual. There obviously were people who thought that the races were equal and that everyone was equal in the eyes of God and whatnot. But that was pretty rare. Most of the people, even in the North, even if they thought slavery was wrong, even if they favored the abolition of slavery, did not feel that there was racial equality. And if we're talking about, people like Abraham Lincoln, this white supremacy was explicit, repeatedly explicit, and borne out in his actions throughout his entire life and his political career. And he is, on this front, very moderate, very, very normal. Um, so slavery ends. One of the reasons it ends is that the South realizes, okay, we have to give up slavery, which many of them had kind of thought was wrong anyway, and that the South was already starting to abolish in the course of the war. Then I made videos about that. That's a very interesting, understood topic. But they had a lot of reasons that they still had consensus with the North. They had a shared nationalism. They all revered George Washington. They revered Andrew Jackson. They revered the Constitution and the American Revolution. And they also agreed on white supremacy, right? They agreed that whites were uh, a better, more responsible, better citizens and whatnot, and that blacks were not, and that even if they can't be slaves, they still should be in a second class citizen, right? Or a non-citizen even. And so that's, the terms of them returning basically allowed for that. And the North had absolutely no qualms about allowing this and allowing Jim Crow to come into the South and to exist in the North at the very least de facto, although maybe in a slightly different form. So that became like the new consensus. But then slowly, the new wave of ideas that more racial equality, more individualistic, more classically liberal kind of look at each individual person, don't have a bias against people, basically more true anti-racism, more true rejection of racism as opposed to just anti-slavery, became more and more common through the course of the 20th century, especially. And by the late 20th century, I think these ideas had essentially won out. Now, you did have some remnants of what people could call racism, all right? You have people who, if they're walking down the street and they see a black person, they might feel a little afraid that they're going to get robbed. And they might subconsciously or consciously have fear about that. But that is not classical racism. Okay, that is not something to belittle somebody for or to rebuke somebody for. That's something that in most cases they can't help. It doesn't harm the person that believes on them. They're not reaching a judgment. They're just reacting to a stereotype. That's something that they can't really control. So that still existed, but most people are even self-consciously aware that they do that and try and mitigate it. And it gets to the point where they will even do stupid things, like go into terribly dangerous situations and be victimized and allow that to happen out of fear of being perceived as racist. But in the last, whatever, 10 years, 5 years, it's been increasing in intensity. We have a new thing, what has some people have called reverse racism, but which is actually just racism. And this has been racism against white people, especially by black people, but by other groups, and essentially by people who are leftists, who are Marxists, who then graft onto what they consider downtrodden minority groups, whether that's Latinos or factory workers or blacks or Arabs or Muslims or whoever else. And this is the narrative that white people are bad, all white people are bad. Sometimes it manifests that all white people are inferior in one way or another. You know, that they're not adapted to warm weather, that they're not very athletically inclined, that they're inherently evil. You know, and this had happened in the past. I mean, you have people like the Black Muslims, the Nation of Islam, that kind of felt this way going all the way back to the 1930s. But those ideas did not penetrate the mainstream. They did not become commonplace ideas, and they were, laughed at, quite frankly. So people like Malcolm X, for most of his political life, believed in this sort of thing, but they were an isolated case. And I'm sure there were other cases, maybe Marcus Garvey or whoever else. And if I'm wrong about that, I don't. I'm just speculating. I don't know that that's the case. But I'm sure it happened in the past, but it didn't become mainstream. It has become mainstream, especially on the left, that white people are guilty of everything. White people are, all our problems are because of the racism of white people and the prejudice of white people and the privilege of white people. On the other hand, you can have explicitly pro-black, a black caucus, programs designed to help blacks, and I'm using blacks shorthand, but this would also apply to other races, other minorities, other marginalized groups, gays, sexuals, transsexuals, all that kind of stuff. Um, well, there is a predictable response to that. Okay. If you are white, you can't win in the eyes of these people. No matter how non-racist you actually are, no matter how non-racist you actually act, no matter how philanthropic, generous you are towards everyone else, or specifically blacks, or specifically Latinos, or whoever else, you are still considered racist by this rhetoric. You are still a racist, horrible person. You're still bad. There's this whole, if we can have black this and black pride and black history month and black that and black this, and uh, we need to have a black president, we need to have black rights and black lives matter. Well, the implication there is that, well, shouldn't white lives matter? Shouldn't whites have rights? Should there be a white history month? Should we have a white appreciation month? Should we study white inventors and white this? It seems very selective to say, well, we should do it for these minority groups, but not these other groups. Well, the natural consequence of this is that some people on some white people are going to say, look, you are all going to have your collectivist racist group for your group, and then you're going to say that we're evil and that you want to advance your group at the expense of my group, at my expense. You're happy to do that. Uh, and nothing that I will do will exonerate myself in your eyes. There's no tax rate, there's no affirmative action program, there's no personal act that I can perform, no utterance that I can speak that will make you do anything other than regard me as a total evil racist who is worthy of nothing but perpetual punishment for crimes that happened hundreds of years ago. Then what's the point of not just actually being racist? I can't escape being racist. We've come to the point where anything at all is racist, right? If I wear the wrong costume, if I use the wrong pronouns, if I don't favor a certain politician or a certain program, even if it has no obvious connection to race or race realism or racism or any minority group, if I'm going to be labeled racist no matter what, if I'm de facto racist no matter what, then why don't I just be a little racist? Now, I don't think this is most white people. This is only appealing. The anti-racist sentiment is so strong and so widespread that this is only going to appeal to a certain margin. But the more ridiculous this gets, the bigger the margin is going to be, right? And if you're going to say we want to structure society in a way to systematically transfer wealth and power from one group to another, you can't be surprised when the victim of that organizes along those same lines, organizes or starts to think along those lines. And I think that we're in the very early stages of this. And as a methodological individualist, as a person who has no problem admitting that there are statistical differences in anything that you can measure between any groups of people, including racist groups, but who also thinks that it's stupid to judge individuals based on aggregates of uh, statistics of entire populations, of someone who believes that people have the freedom of association. If that means that they want to miscegenate and mix with each other, they will. And if they want to segregate and not do that, that's fine and it's not a problem. Go ahead, have your right. You have every right to do that. Who's against forced integration, but not for having it be some ultimate goal that you need to integrate, right? I don't think that there's some moral obligation to go and interact with every other kind of person. I mean the logic there would be like it's not good enough that you would just go and interact with black people. You would have to go and interact with every single race and every single religion and every single sexual preference. And I mean, like your entire social sphere would have to be regulated, and then we'd have to weight it and be like, well, race X is discriminated against or whatever, oppressed or marginalized, by this factor, and so you should spend that much time with them. But this other group is only marginalized by a different factor, so you should have more time or less time. Yeah, I'm not sure. Doesn't make any sense. It's completely stupid. Just be free, interact with who you want to interact with. There's going to be a lot of natural segregation that's going to happen, and that's fine. There's going to be interaction where it's mutually beneficial. That's fine and should not be stopped. And that's where I start to have problems with some of the race realists. I don't know what their intentions. If they're okay with allowing that, then I don't mind. If they're talking about throwing up barriers of entry or barriers of interaction because they're against that, then that's a problem, and I disagree with it. But we have now come to this point though where we're starting to get these two poles, the one, and then had created the reaction and the reaction, and of course the Alex Joneses of the world are going to think this is intended. I don't think it's intended. I don't think that most of the people, the Antifas, that the Marxists, that the racist minorities out there, that they desire to create white racism. I doubt most of them do. Maybe there's a few who, for practical reasons or for strategic reasons, thought that that would be a good idea. I don't think that's most of them, though. I think most of them have eaten up a lot of collectivist rhetoric, a lot of racist rhetoric, a lot of politically correct garbage about history, about genetics, about life, about politics. And the implications of all of that rhetoric is racist, right? Is the idea that there are different groups and that these groups have different rights and that they have different historical narratives and that there's a process. A lot of this stuff is, Frankfurt School, Marxist influence, and they buy into it, they believe it, and now we're getting to the point where we have the first generation of like basically adults, semi-adults, although they act very childish, who have been raised on this and who believe this and actually don't even, from what I can tell, have any concept of any other belief system, right? I mean, the people who are going nuts over, you know, uh, the pronouns, and again, I'm starting to mix and match issues here, but I think that they're kind of stem from similar causes and they're having similar effects. Or the type of costume, or the people who, the type of costume you wear at Halloween, or whatever, the people who are going crazy about that, uh, those people are a new breed and they're heavily, heavily divorced from reality, right? I don't think black people who grew up in the 80s are going to have that perspective. At least they didn't grow up with that perspective. They may, when the choice has to be made, fall onto that side, sure, but I don't think that your average African American in the 1990s who was an adult and who had a job, uh, or one who didn't have a job and was on the street, would have thought along these lines. This is something, as Jonathan Haidt has pointed out, has kind of really germanized and grown, uh, germinated, not germanized, germinated in four-year elite college universities. And it's not a big population, but it has a disproportionate effect on the media, on the news, on literature, on culture, and you have this minority that has this view, and then within the broader left, there is nothing in the rhetoric of the broader left that allows them to, even if they don't believe these ideas specifically, even if they're more moderate, there's nothing in their rhetoric that allows them to counter this. They can't bring themselves to tell a Black Lives Matter person, you're wrong, all lives matter. You're ironically and obviously going completely against, the most famous speech here on this, on the plagiarized speech of MLK about, what matters is the content of your character and all that. Equality of opportunity, not of outcome. Again, I'm not endorsing that, but and they have no way to reply against it. And so you have a de facto, all the left now is tainted with this and tied to this. The left has suffered among moderates. Moderate Democrats have become moderate Republicans. This is something that happened throughout the Obama years. Something like 1,000 Democratic seats at the state level and the federal level were lost to moderate Republicans, leaving the power in the party being in the hands of the most um, illiberal, the most um, politically correct, asinine, race baiting people. So there's going to be a reaction against it, and I find this lamentable on all sides. I certainly don't agree with white nationalism. I certainly don't agree with racism. Like I've said repeatedly, I'm a methodological individualist, and I've outlined how I feel about it. But I'm not surprised by what's going on based on how history has been going. You can't tell people repeatedly that you're evil, that you're stupid, that you're wrong, that all of it. And here's the other issue here. It's so blatantly special pleading and selective, the narrative that is used against white people. It's to go and say you white people are guilty of slavery, as if that could not be said of black people, as if that could not be said of Chinese people or Arab people or Native American people. In fact, if we're talking about slavery, if we're talking about equality among the races, right? Because racial bigotry is not unique to Western culture. It's ubiquitous to all cultures. What's unique to Western culture is abolishing slavery, is thinking that there might actually be a general humanity that is more important and that rises above racial distinctions. Even if those distinctions are real, even if there are actual differences, there is a humanity beyond that that is worthy of paying attention to and of valuing and of having a system that recognizes that, of recognizing that. That's right. That's the thing that stands out as different from Western culture, if we're especially talking the UK and the United States, from everybody else. And I think this is also clear when we're talking about, to talk about a related issue, the stuff of removing Confederate statues. As if that could not be done to all of our presidents, pretty much. Like, you don't think Lincoln was a white supremacist? He said he was, explicitly, repeatedly. He thought slavery was just fine where it existed, and that he envisioned it lasting for another 100 years. He was against its spread. He thought that it was wrong, but there wasn't anything that he could do about it as president. He thought that blacks were inferior, that they shouldn't be on juries, that they shouldn't vote, that they could be discriminated against civilly. He never treated individual blacks with anything other than total contempt, other than the exception of Frederick Douglass. That was the only black who he called by his first name. Everyone else he called him boy or auntie. And that's just him. We could talk about all the other ones, and the fact that there are, and even post in the Reconstruction era, no one's calling for the removal of Woodrow Wilson monuments. Woodrow Wilson, right? Because he was perfect, because he wasn't racist, because he didn't ban blacks from working for the federal government, or FDR. No one's calling for that. No one's The Democratic Party was the Democratic Party was the party of the KKK on up until what, the 90s? At least the 60s. At least. Are we going to rename all the stuff in West Virginia after William C. Byrd? Because he was literally in the Klan, right? The selective outrage here. Oh, Donald Trump got endorsed by this guy. No one said shit about Barack Obama praising a Klansman, which he did explicitly, overtly, right? So this selective outrage is so hypocritical. It's nauseating, right? And to anyone who's aware of the hypocrisy, they're going to have utter contempt for it, right? Whatever you think about the South, you can't say, well, the South is all evil and then everything else that's fine, right? And I fall into the camp of I'm against monuments to some of these people. I don't like the idea of glorifying the state or its agents, but whatever, big deal. That's how it is, and it's I don't look at a statue of Robert E. Lee and be like, well, he's worse than Hitler, but then look at Ulysses S. Grant, I'm like, yeah, he's fine. William Tecumseh Sherman, yeah, he's fine. Uh, right, and so they're on top of saying that whites are evil and they're responsible for everything and that they can't be not racist no matter what they do. They're saying we want to erase your history. We want to go after everything about your culture that we possibly can and destroy it. And that runs against everything in people's moral values, right? About their ideas of sanctity, right? Oh, this is part of our culture and our history, and you want to like spit on it and cover it in diarrhea? Of course, I'm going to be against that. And so people who would never even think about being racist are going to have sympathy, are going to are going to be like, well, I agree with Richard Spencer on this point. They're and so they're hurting more and more. Again, it's marginal. I think it's small, but what do they expect that they can brutally victimize, at least rhetorically, and announce plans to do so politically to one group and then be surprised when they organize against you and react against you? What do you think is going to happen? So uh, it's a pretty shitty situation, and it's going to get worse because and I've talked about this before in my video a little while ago called Are We Going to Head Towards Another Civil War? We can't talk about this. We cannot have a discussion, at least among 99% of the population. All right, there are a few people who will listen, but it's a tiny, tiny minority that will get drowned out in the tidal wave of the tsunami of racist rhetoric on both sides, one side especially, but more and more on the other, on the other side, because we can't have a discussion about it. We don't even understand the terms. We don't in terms of political dialogue, right, there's no consensus. Now, there's consensus on other things that we said, oh, it's a nice day. Okay, I'm sure they can understand that. Oh, uh, I like that car. Okay, maybe I like that car too. Yeah, but as soon as we start talking about politics and history and ethics and race, or religion, it's out the door. You know, uh, I say black, you hear white. I say white, you and the fact that we can't talk about it, the fact that dialogue has become increasingly difficult, and we've been able to segment ourselves into these echo chambers, which reinforce whatever view we already currently have, to the point where any contrary view just seems like completely asinine and impossible and must be from a Luddite retard who has nothing but malicious intent against everybody else, then yeah, it's not going to end well. You're not going to have a civil protest and a counter protest. You're not going to have an exchange of ideas. You're not going to have a battle of ideas. We can't have a battle of ideas when our concepts have become so muddled and so loaded with uh, politically correct innuendo that words are losing their meaning. They're becoming to mean anything. Racism is a perfect example. Racism has come to mean almost anything. Anyone can be racist no matter what they do, except for certain groups, and then that doesn't make any sense to other people, right? So it doesn't look good. It looks like things are going to escalate and get worse without any clear evidence of how they could de-escalate, other than perhaps, and I hate to even say this, some kind of massive, massive tragedy. It's like a war or an invasion or something like that that unites people, however temporarily, right? But that's not a solution so much as a temporary palliative, I would have to say, unless one side got eliminated in the process, which I would certainly not advocate. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the issues. I don't see where it's going to go. I don't find it, I mean, it's interesting in the historical context. I don't find the actual debates people are having to be even remotely interesting or remotely productive. I would much rather be up hiking in the mountains or going to the gym or restoring my fucking foreskin than having to try and pare through the weeds on this. But that's what we're coming to. So anyway, I'll talk to y'all later and have a good day.